Well, good evening, everyone. We've got Rory here with us now. I see that Rory's online, and can I welcome you? I'm Paul Lucas. I'm president of the Queensland branch of the AIIA. We're very excited about it. There he is.
Paul. Yeah.
Good evening. We're very excited about Professor Rory Medcalf to speaking to us tonight, and to do a bit of a launch and talk about his very, very good book, The Contest for the Indo-Pacific, which now in this COVID environment seems even more topical than it ever was. Can I tell you a little bit about Rory, a very distinguished Australian? He is head of the National Security College at ANU. He has 3 decades of experience across diplomacy, intelligence analysis, think tanks, academia and journalism, including as founding director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute in government. He worked as a senior strategic analyst with the then Office of National Assessments in Canberra's peak intelligence agency. He was also an Australian diplomat with experience in India, Japan and Papua New Guinea, and continues to lead informal strategic dialogues with India and several other Indo-Pacific powers. He has contributed to 3 landmark reports on nuclear arms control and was on the expert panel for the Australian government's 2016 Defence White Paper. He has been recognised as a thought leader internationally for his work on the Indo-Pacific strategic concept, as articulated in his acclaimed 2020 book, Contest for the Indo-Pacific. He is a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum Register of Experts and Eminent Persons and the board of the National Foundation for Australia-Chinese Relations. So we'll give you a link, and you have a link about the book. But after you hear Rory and ask some questions, I think you, like me, will be very keen to learn even more. So over to you, Rory, and welcome, and great to hear from you.
Paul, thank you. And I want to thank not only you, but all colleagues at the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Queensland. I've got a particular soft spot for AIIA in Brisbane because, of course, I studied at the University of Queensland and worked in Queensland as a journalist for some time. So I have a semi-Queensland connection, and it's always good to reconnect with the international affairs scene in Brisbane, which I know is flourishing. I'm going to offer a few opening remarks about the book, if I may, just setting the scene. And I'll speak for about 20 minutes or so, really explaining why I wrote this book, what its key argument is, and why I guess it's unfortunately very relevant to what's happening in the world today. But I'm especially interested in time for discussion and answering questions, and I'll stay as long as I can. I'm also going to, if you don't mind, inflict on all of the participants some maps, because the book is partly about maps and about how mental maps really help decision makers to frame the world. So what I'm going to do just for a moment now is, well, no, the host has disabled attendee screen sharing. I will ask in a moment if the host can enable me to share my screen, because once I've done that, I can pull up some slides that I want to talk through. But while we're waiting, hopefully, for that technical miracle to occur, that's fine, because I'll start explaining the book without the visuals. So there are actually 2 editions of the book, and the edition we're speaking about tonight, Contest for the Indo-Pacific, is the Australian edition. The international edition has a different title for reasons I can go into later, but it is the same book, so please only buy one edition if you're interested in reading it. But this book, Contest for the Indo-Pacific, Why China Won't Map the Future, is it's a bit provocatively titled at one level. It's not an anti-China book. There's the screen sharing, so I'll pull up the maps as I talk. It's not an anti-China book, but what it is a book about the wider region. It's a book about the Indo-Pacific, the fact that China is only part of a much larger region, and we often forget about that in a lot of our commentary on international affairs. If you follow the headlines on any given day, you know, there are problems in the Australia-China relationship, and the argument is made that Australia needs to fix this. Well, I think this tends to overlook the fact that China is rising in a very large and complex region, and part of the thesis of the book is to position China in perspective in this much larger region, which is not only the Asia-Pacific, as many of us were familiar with the term in the late 20th century, but something larger called the Indo-Pacific. And so this first slide that I'm sharing with you just gives you a sense of scale, a sense of the region that we're talking about here, the region that in fact is Australia's natural home. Now, for much of the late 20th century, it was very popular to think about Australia's region, that is the region that we needed to engage with economically, diplomatically, strategically, as being the Asia-Pacific, essentially East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, and of course the Pacific all the way over to North America. But the argument in my book is that that was actually a very artificial way of understanding the world and understanding the region, and that we were in fact returning to a much more, I guess, traditional place in the world, and that is where we started as a nation, that is Australia as a continent with 3 oceans around it, but of course 2 very prominent oceans in world affairs, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. We have a west coast, and interestingly, this was rediscovered over the past 20 years, not because India rose to prominence, and part of my story is to say that India is important, that India and other powers in the region matter as well as China, but also because the rise of China inevitably brought Chinese interests and influence, and indeed everything all the way down to military presence, into the Indian Ocean. And as you can see in this first map in the presentation, which in fact I've shamelessly copied from an Australian Defence Department map of about 7 years ago, when Australia became the first country in the world to formally recognise its region as being the Indo-Pacific. It's the connections, it's the connectivity between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans through the energy, the trade, all of those sinews of commerce and prosperity and human well-being that binds our region into one whole, into the Indo-Pacific. And so the very fact that China, Japan, South Korea, so many of the East Asian and Southeast Asian countries were turning their attention southward and westwards towards the Indian Ocean, and India, as it re-emerged from its own relatively closed economic status of the mid to late 20th century, began to look east. The scene was set for this Indo-Pacific strategic environment. Now, that may seem all well and good and a little bit of a geopolitics 101 lecture. The important thing is, what does it mean? And so the book really has 2 arguments. The first argument is to say that those of us who were still imagining the region as the Asia-Pacific and were forgetting about the Indian Ocean, forgetting about those sea lanes going all the way to the Middle East and Africa, forgetting about the rise of India, and who were just fixated on China and the Asia-Pacific, we really had the story wrong and we needed to correct the perspective. So part of the book is literally to, if you like, act as a kind of corrective to some of the misperceptions and misinformation about Australia's strategic environment and our place in the world. And so that's, I guess, a descriptive argument of the book. The other part of the book, though, is very much about the so what. What does this mean for policy, for the big decisions that countries have to make to secure their future, particularly in this era now, as we're seeing with the coronavirus, where contagion in every sense is the order of the day, where the connectivity that nations have built up over the past 30 or 40 years is now suddenly showing its downside. It's showing the rapid vectors for not only disease, but also political instability, crisis, economic coercion, and so forth. The book argues then that now that we're in this larger strategic system, a country like Australia can turn the scale of the Indo-Pacific to our advantage, because it gives us a much larger group of nations with which to partner against the destabilising elements in the international system, such as, in particular, the coercive use of Chinese power. It's also a region that's too large to dominate, and we'll come to that in a moment, because there is, in my argument, a kind of an echo of the history of the Indo-Pacific, which is a history of empires, and it's a history of empires that have generally, in the end, failed, as pretty much all empires do eventually. So I guess this began in my own mind as a book that was intended to really set the scene for Australia's foreign policy choices in the 21st century in this Indo-Pacific framework. But once I really got into the research, I mean the historical research, what I found really quite astonishing is how consistent an Indo-Pacific framework has been with the way the region has behaved and been viewed throughout history. So we often imagine that there are these very specific blocks of the world. There's Asia, there's Europe, there's Africa, mental maps, if you like. And part of the argument of my book is to say that actually mental maps, well, they certainly hold power, because maps influence the decisions of leaders, they influence the choices of policymakers, they influence decisions about who is in and who is out of the diplomatic conversations that matter, or what are the kinds of military capabilities we want to develop and what range will they have, or who will we trade with, where should we set up diplomatic missions, and so forth. So mental maps have always mattered, but these mental maps are really about what's politically useful. There's nothing completely natural about them. And so, for example, when we hear the term Asia, we're actually hearing a term that was first developed by ancient Greeks to describe the entire world that lay to their east. And it's a definition that then shifted back and forth throughout history and has been used and misused by governments ever since. I mean, for example, China today promotes a particular coordination mechanism, the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures, very boring name, but it's essentially an Asian for the Asians forum. Only the Asians, from China's perspective in that forum, are the Asian countries that China perceives as reasonably friendly or easily dominated. And so, for example, Japan and Indonesia have not been included in that formulation of Asia, but Russia has. So mental maps are something that governments can play with. Having said that, as I said, there's been this striking consistency throughout most of recorded history where the region we imagine as Asia, and particularly the maritime region of maritime Asia, was one system. The Indian Ocean, the Pacific Oceans, the sea lanes of Southeast Asia connecting them were viewed as a continuum. And so, for example, this map from the 1400s, a Korean map, and you can tell it's Korean because it's got a very large Korea and a very small Japan. This map imagined South Asia, East Asia, China, India, Southeast Asia, all as really one block. And the settlements along the coast were particularly important because of maritime trade. The archipelago of Southeast Asia was important as well. This really, if you like, reminded us that right through recorded history, going back to the ancient Indian civilizations that had influenced Southeast Asia. Remember, of course, the export of Buddhism and Hinduism as India's major soft power export, the journey of Islam into East Asia and Southeast Asia as well, as a South Asia and Southeast Asia as well. These were essentially Indo-Pacific journeys. The region wasn't broken up into sub-regions. And this was important because the book is partly an effort to, if you like, turn the table on particularly the Chinese government propagandist narrative that somehow China's rightful place is not only at the centre of the world, but at the centre of the Asian system, and that it has always been thus, that China has always, by right, dominated Asia. In fact, China was prominent, but not dominant in the old Indo-Pacific of the old Indian civilizations or Islam, or indeed, as came later, European colonialism. In fact, there was only one really substantial foray by China into the Indian Ocean, and before the 21st century, that is, and that, of course, ended in retreat. The journey of the treasure ships of Zheng He in the early 1400s, and extraordinarily their return back to China after a number of voyages, and the destruction of the fleet and a decision by the empire not to go there again. And of course, European adventurers seized that opportunity. European colonialism seized that moment, and the colonial era began. Now, the book recounts a little of the history, or retells a little of the history of Asia through this two-ocean lens, including the history of European colonialism, with all of its downsides, with the brutality, the cultural chauvinism, and so forth, that actually broke a lot of the connections of the old Indo-Pacific, a lot of the connections between Asian societies, and re-established new connections between those Asian societies and the European colonial centres. In other words, colonialism also reinforced the connection of maritime Asia to the global system, reinforced those trading connections, the importance of the sea lanes, and so in its own way influenced the modern Indo-Pacific. And of course, in their pushback against European colonialism, Asian societies and Asian powers likewise took a unified Pan-Asian view, almost a kind of Indo-Pacific view. And so if you look at the mental maps of Asia throughout history, whether it's going back to the Korean map of the 1400s, or this really extraordinary Dutch map from 1570 by Ortelius of Antwerp, this was from the first semi-accurate atlas, if you like, of the world, of the known world, you see that striking resemblance to the very same region that we imagine today as the Indo-Pacific, an emphasis on the connection between the sub-regions, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, all in a single frame, coastlines accentuated, seaports accentuated. You even see in this map North America, the trade connections that were already occurring into Asia, and even a hint of Australia. It's interesting that that little patch of land in the middle of the bottom of this frame is labelled beach. So perhaps those Dutch map makers knew something about Australia even in the 16th century. Now, of course, there are a few somewhat creative flourishes to this map, the mermaids and the sea monsters and such like, but I would argue that they're no more mythical than some of the creative flourishes we see on maps today, such as China's 9-dash line in the South China Sea. What's more important is that in the 1500s, there was already this concept of the Indo-Pacific as a single system, as a strategic system, as an economic system, where the behaviour and interests of one power influence the behaviour and interests of others. And so in a sense, as we moved through history, the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, we saw this become the norm. Ideas of Asia were of one unified region where India and China, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Oceans were considered part of a very clearly integrated whole. And that's really in stark contrast to the way that the region was then imagined in the late 20th century when my own generation of policymakers and diplomats and academics grew up with this idea that somehow the Indian Ocean and India were not our business and that we just needed to focus on a very China-centric version of Asia. But as you see, even in these maps, and this diagonally pivoted map here is one of my favourites from the Australian explorer, or Scottish Australian explorer, Thomas Mitchell in 1848. The idea of Australia connecting with all of Asia, including the Indian Ocean, for our trade, for our defence, for our security, for all forms of diplomatic engagement. It's not a new idea. The Indo-Pacific was there all along. And what's also, I think, striking as I began researching these maps was to discover that some of this way of seeing the world that was actually commonplace in 19th century Australia, but then we sort of forgot about after the Second World War when we began focusing so heavily on East Asia and ignoring the Indian Ocean and India. This Indo-Pacific idea of our region and this idea of, as we did in Australia, pivoting the map to capture, I guess, Asia in a single portrait-shaped frame, has a funny resemblance to the way that the Chinese government now imagines the world. Map making, mental maps are partly about policy and the, I guess, frameworks for leaders to make decisions by, and partly, I guess, about strategic wish making. And so the book really draws parallels between a lot of the imperial map making of the European empires and the way in which China is beginning to see the region and the world. And we'll come back to this, this interesting Chinese world map in a moment, because you might notice, among other things, that as well as the Indian Ocean being the centre of the world, with all of its connectivity, resources and so forth, the American continent has been split in two and cast to the outer edges of the universe. So there's something of Chinese strategic wish-making in this map, which is, I'm told, very popular with the PLA Navy. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit bogged down in the maps, I warned you, but I guess the key message here is that while we're hearing at the moment in a lot of Chinese policy, the statements by the Chinese government that the idea of the Indo-Pacific is a nonsense, it's against China's interests. In reality, we're seeing China not only imagine this integrated two-ocean region, but we're seeing Chinese behaviour, much more importantly, reaching out across the two oceans. We've all heard of the Belton Road, and our friends in the Victorian government are hearing about it a lot at the moment. But the Belton Road, whatever else it means, a Chinese aid program, or maybe a play at international infrastructure and connectivity, or maybe a highway for influence. I mean, take your pick. But whatever the Belton Road actually is, it certainly embraces this two-ocean region of the Indo-Pacific. In fact, the Maritime Silk Road, which is the maritime half of the Belton Road, is basically the Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics. It gives us a mental map of the space across which the People's Republic of China is seeking to exert influence. Now, we can debate what kind of influence that is. Is it the normal influence of a rising great power, or is it something approaching neo-colonial or maybe even imperial ambitions? We can have that conversation, but we can certainly see very clearly the space, the map over which it is meant to extend. And the book argues that that actually has risks for China. It has benefits, but it has risks as well. You know, we're all aware of the great connectivity of our region, but we're also increasingly aware that it brings those risks of rapid cascading shocks, contagion, as I've said. You can use terms like black swans or black elephants to describe these unexpected shocks. But the key point is that whatever disruption occurs to the system cannot be contained to one place anymore. We saw, of course, with coronavirus, what began essentially as a localized epidemic within China, rapidly becoming a regional and indeed a global pandemic. Likewise, the book argues that because the Chinese system is so based these days on, I guess, the Communist Party seeking to maintain its legitimacy at home by projecting strength abroad, and much of that projection of strength is across the Indo-Pacific, where Chinese Navy has now returned quite formidably for the first time in 600 years, and this time plans to stay. It also means then that shocks to the system, whether they're shocks that occur domestically in China or whether they're crises that occur outside of China, are going to reverberate, really affecting all countries in the region and affecting China internally as well. And it's going to be very interesting to watch how the current face-off on the India-China border plays out in that regard. So look, I'll wrap up on a couple of the so what's, the policy conclusions from my book. I mean, as I said at the beginning, this is, although the subtitle of the book, Why China Won't Map the Future, suggests it could be seen as an anti-China book. It's not, I think, in any narrow sense, an anti-China book. It's certainly not against the Chinese nation or people or culture. It is a book, however, that questions very directly the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party, and especially the agenda of Xi Jinping as leader under his leadership. Because what's happened, I think, is that over the past 10 years, he and his leadership group have essentially taken the decision to double down on internal repression, on authoritarianism, on nationalism, and we've all heard about Wolf Warrior. If you haven't seen the movie, I recommend that you do, because it does provide a fascinating window into the psychology of Chinese nationalism, but also that Xi Jinping has made a massive gamble on the projection of Chinese power and interest abroad, whether it's through economic means or also through security means, military, espionage, and so forth. And I think, to be fair, that the jury is actually out on whether that gamble is going to pay off. My argument in the book is that it's a very high risk, high stakes game. China spends a lot of money persuading us of three things: that its rise is benign, that its rise is unstoppable, and thirdly, that if you get in the way, you will be hurt. There's an interesting set of contradictions there. The book poses questions about that and basically says that China is biting off more than it can chew. That through the Belton Road, through a lot of its activities in the region, in a sense, China is overextending. It has seized a window in time, perhaps the leadership noting that the population is going to age, that there are problems of descent and environmental degradation and so forth domestically, and that perhaps this is the best window, the best moment for China to lock in its power gains in the world. But having said that, there's an impulse towards overextension, and I would argue, as I conclude in the book, that it is actually in the interests of the many other countries in the region, Australia and all the other middle powers, to set limits to Chinese influence, to band together when they can in pushing back, because this is a book about multipolarity, a sea of many flags, which the region has always been. And that by building those new linkages and pushing back, in fact, in time, we may actually be doing China a favour, helping to find a settling point for its ambitions, short of crisis and short of conflict. There's a lot more I can say, but I think I should leave it there at this stage, Paul, and let's go to the discussion.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much, Rory. That has been a fantastic kickoff. And we've got a number of questions that have come in, and I'll encourage some more as well. But I might lead off with a question to you. Your book, you talk about that it's not just a bilateral world. It's not China and the US. It's far broader than that. You give an example that by 2050, the economies of Indonesia, Japan, and India combined will be much larger in size than either China or the US. And so it is not a question of this binary choice. Indeed, you speak about multilateralism and quads. I see Peter Verghese doesn't have Indonesia in the quad that he has. He has the US. I'm more attracted to the Indonesian one. Can you talk about these quads? Can you talk about what the middle powers, as you describe them? And of course, we're not economically massive like some of those others, but you see us as having a role there.
Yeah, no, thank you. So first thing to note is that in some ways, some of the projections in the book have already been affected or overtaken by COVID-19. I mean, this book was completed late last year, went to print at the beginning of this year, at a time when I suspect not even the Chinese leadership knew the full extent of the calamity that was unfolding out of Wuhan. But having said that, the book does make the argument that every time we hear all these optimistic projections that China will have the largest economy in the world by any measure, it already does by one measure, but not by another, and that somehow we just have to get with the program now and sign on to, I guess, a Chinese-dominated region. We forget about the strength and the agency and the growth of the rest. And the same, in fact, often the same forecasters who project the growth in the Chinese economy will also project the growth in the economies of Indonesia, India, Vietnam, a lot of the other countries of Asia. Japan is not growing, but it's so substantial still that even a weaker Japan is going to be a very major balancing force in the years to come. And this is all putting America out of the picture for the moment. So indeed, I do make the point slightly cheekily early in the book to say that by the 2040s or towards 2050, India, Indonesia and Japan combined will have a larger economy than China, a larger population than China. Actually, they already have a larger population than China. In fact, India will very soon have a larger population than China, but even a larger defence budget than China. Now, that begs a few questions. One, of course, is how on earth are those countries going to band together to achieve any kind of effective solidarity to balance against China? But also the enormous problems that those countries face. And we're already seeing with India and Indonesia that they're going to be hard hit by COVID-19, and that is going to slow the economic projections that I wrote about in the book. But they are youthful countries, they're young countries, they're resilient countries, they're what I would call anti-fragile countries as well. And so if you're giving me a 20 to 30 year time frame, I still think they're going to be very substantial powers, and they're going to have very different interests to the interests of China. I think the error that China has made, and is still making to some degree, is that it seems actually quite effective at provoking this balancing behaviour by other countries. It had a chance before around, I'd say 2010, first decade of this century. China was working very hard on a charm offensive and also on allowing a reasonable degree of opening up at home. And that was the hopeful window, I think, for China. But what we saw instead is that over the last 10 years, China has effectively managed to, one by one and sometimes simultaneously, deepen mistrust with most of its key neighbours. And India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Japan, I would rate very heavily in that list. So what's the opportunity now? Again, it's not about forming hard alliances against China. And I think one of the myths about the so-called quadrilateral, and for participants, listeners' awareness, most of you will know this, but those who may not, the quadrilateral that we hear about a lot, the quadrilateral dialogue or Quad, is a grouping of Australia, India, Japan and the United States. We're not a formal alliance, but we share a lot of our assessments. We have regular diplomatic meetings. We're beginning to do things like training and coordination and so on together. And it's potentially a very powerful grouping. It's not going to turn into a hard alliance anytime soon, but nor is it going to disappear. It was a group of countries that got together originally to respond to the terrible tsunami in the Indian Ocean back in 2004. So it was a disaster relief mechanism to begin with. It was temporarily walked away from by the Rudd government at a time when a lot of countries were getting cold feet about that sort of thing. But it's now back with a vengeance. And interestingly, it's becoming a core group now for coordination on the COVID-19 response and the development of alternative supply chains, particularly for sensitive industries. So the Quad has a future, but minilateralism, that interesting term that essentially means small groups of countries self-selecting to cooperate for practical purposes, minilateralism really is the name of the game now in the Indo-Pacific. Australia, India, Japan, to some extent Indonesia. There's even an Australia-India-France dialogue that goes on quietly behind the scenes. So there's all sorts of creative new arrangements that are being produced because we're in a bigger region now with greater connectivity. We know we have a wider range of friends to choose from. Most of us, these players in the middle, are nervous very much about Chinese power, but also about American dysfunction. And we're just really testing the boundaries of what we can do with one another. So I see minilateralism as part of this Indo-Pacific wave of the future. And look, I agree, Paul, we should play with creative arrangements. There's no reason why we can't try to bring Indonesia into one of these in time.
One of our questioners, a former Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, once described the Pacific as the hole in the APEC donut. What risk is there that the Pacific, that is the Pacific Island states, could suffer the same fate in an Indo-Pacific construct?
Look, it's a great question, and I'm very sensitive to the interests of the Pacific Island states that are often very, very unlike the interests of the larger states in the Indo-Pacific. But I'd turn it around a little bit, and I'd actually challenge the idea that the Indo-Pacific neglects the Pacific. Actually, I think it privileges the island states of the South Pacific, or it will over time, provided that countries like Australia can really follow through on a lot of their commitments. What do I mean by that? I mean, at one level, the Indo-Pacific is criticised as being somehow an excuse for big countries to ban, or middle-sized countries to band together to balance against China. But I would argue that objectively, the Indo-Pacific came about partly because countries like China were extending their economic and strategic interests much further from home into the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. So in a way, the rest of us are responding to, I guess, the first moves by China. The Asia-Pacific idea, which again went through a rather sort of tortured beginning in the 1970s and 80s, and was about somehow connecting Southeast Asia, East Asia, North America, Australia, and so on. We wanted to keep the Americans engaged in the region. We wanted to make the most of the growth of the tiger economies and so on. That regional construct never really had a place for the Pacific Island countries, or for the Indian Ocean island countries for that matter. The difference about the Indo-Pacific is that it is primarily a maritime region, because my book makes arguments that the maritime will prevail over the continental, will prevail over the land in economic relations and in military influence as well. And we can have that conversation if we have time. But the Indo-Pacific does privilege the connectivity through the sea lanes and the maritime space. And so, in a way, countries like Australia or our partners like Japan, for example, are looking now very closely at the needs and the dynamics of nations and societies in the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And we're also finding interesting parallels because in many ways their concerns about governance, about population health, about resource security, about protecting their sovereignty, they're quite similar in both the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And the Indian Ocean, as the book argues, already provides a kind of a laboratory for what can go wrong. And so if you look at the story of Maldives, of the Chinese influence through Belton Road, debt initiatives in Maldives, if you look at the pushback by a democratically elected government against that in Maldives, it partly because the previous government had been corrupt in its China dealings, you actually see almost a template for how things could unfold in the Pacific. And I think it's in our interest now for a country like Australia to, yes, help our Pacific neighbours focus on their needs, their material needs and the development of their societies, but also to be much more mindful about the protection of their sovereignty than some of the unfortunate countries in the Indian Ocean have been.
I've got a number of questions and I'll try and group them together because you're getting great interest, you're stimulating a lot of discussion, and they relate perhaps to the perception of China at the moment as a result of a number of behaviours. We've seen the potential of the COVID-19 backlash against them, the perception of some of the behaviour of the Chinese government's reaction to criticism overseas, the Hong Kong issues, how Australia has handled the Chinese issue with respect to World Health Organization, but generally, how do you see, it seems that it's really quite counterproductive for China at the moment, almost a sort of a ham-fisted way of handling disputes that necessarily happen between countries in the world. What are your comments on that?
Yeah, look, I would guess recap my point that I preface all of this by saying, this is not an anti-China book in a civilizational sense, but it is a book that points out, I think, a lot of the self-harm that the CCP under its current leadership is doing to China's interests. A great counterfactual would be to imagine China in the early 1990s and to imagine that we didn't have a China where intense nationalist indoctrination had become the order of the day, because you have to remember that after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, one of the ways in which the Communist Party sought to assert control and reassert control over the population was suddenly to make nationalism really at the centre of education. And in that involved in many cases a demonisation or a re-demonisation of the West, of America in particular, of Japan as well. And I guess Australia falls somewhere in the category of a minor demon in that cosmology. That's a real shame, because you know, there was and is, I think, a great need, as in any major state among the Chinese people, for a country, for a government that first and foremost puts their full comprehensive development, that is their economic development, in a stable and peaceful international environment, really right to the fore. But unfortunately, the needs of economic development in China, which are absolutely desirable and right and in many ways commendable, have clashed with that intense nationalist impulse that the party has been using to deepen its control. And in the last 10 years, this has only gotten worse, sad to say. So I think in a way, there is, you know, there's almost, perhaps there's an accidental imperialism forming. I mean, I think I'm not of the view, as some are, and you'll find some in, for example, the Trump administration, who'll say that China has essentially a master plan, you know, for domination, that everything it does is wrong or a lie or a risk. You know, that's not true. But those voices in the Chinese system that want a more moderate way of engaging with the world are at the moment submerged, suppressed, repressed, you know, in many cases imprisoned or silenced. And so instead, you've got this, as I would argue, self-defeating nationalism, this kind of sorcerer's apprentice that's been, you know, unleashed. And so in a sense, I fear that the Chinese system almost can't help itself now. And so, for example, if there is a clash with another country over an issue of interests or principle, and I could list 10 countries right now that this has happened to in the past few years, China's always in the right. The other country's behaviour is always an insult to the feelings of the Chinese people, according to the Communist Party. And the only solution can be, I think, you know, even an even greater toughening of China's line. And I see a contradiction that will play out more and more over time there. And I was absolutely serious about the watching the Wolf Warrior movie, because we're now seeing that echoed in Chinese diplomacy. It's not sustainable, in my view, certainly not over a 10 to 20 year time frame. They might get away with it for a number of years, but over a generational time frame, it's not going to be sustainable, I think, for China to really see every act of resistance to its interests, or to the way it sees its interests, as being something that cannot be compromised with. And I think you will see, and I think we saw the first hints of this with COVID-19, you will see parts of the Chinese population openly rejecting that kind of thinking. I mean, there will be continued rule through falsehood and fear, and also through, in many cases, the satisfaction of economic need, which is a good thing. But I do think that that over time, it's going to get harder for the party to convince the Chinese population of all of these issues. And I guess some of the data I draw on for that in my book is simply by aggregating the number of people of either Chinese origin or over whom China claims sovereignty, who have one way or another already rejected a totalitarian vision of rule by the Chinese Communist Party. You know, if you bring together in a kind of mental arithmetic, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Taiwanese, Hong Kongers, pro-democracy activists, the Falun Gong movement, and so on, you've already got a population there that is larger than Russia or Bangladesh, of people who are not happy at some point or other with the rule of the CCP. No wonder the party and the leadership show such extreme anxiety. There's a great book that I'd recommend, even better than mine, by a guy named Carl Mintzner, who's an American international lawyer, and another by Dave Shambo, a great China scholar. Their two books, End of an Era and I think China's Future, question mark, better than I do portray the contradictions in this in this system internally, and make the view that the only solution for the party over, let's say, the next 10 to 20 years is to start easing its controls, to start moderating, and to start moderating its external belligerence as well.
We've got so many questions, and we've only got 16 minutes left, so I'll double.
I'll give you short answers this time, Paul.
I'll double a few up.
Yeah.
One questioner, where does Vietnam fit in? You go to Vietnam,
yeah.
They will tell you that the United States and France were a mere, puff in the wind compared to their relationship with China and the occupation for 1,000 years and getting rid of them. The first question is, where do they fit in? They're an increasingly substantial country, but they share a border with China. So that's the first one. How do you see them, and how do they see themselves? The second question is that the Asia-Pacific has real institutions, APEC, ASEAN, whereas Indo-Pacific doesn't really have. It has meetings, as you say, quads. It has not a robust institution with a secretariat. What do you say is needed to give a real cohesive organisational structure around that Indo-Pacific construct?
Great. So Vietnam, look, I think, and there is a few sections in the book on Vietnam. I've got a lot of respect for the way in which Vietnam handles relations with China. I think we could learn a lot from the Vietnamese on that. But I think we should make absolutely no mistake that Vietnam is a model of the kind of other Asian nationalism that China underestimates at its peril, and I'd say that Indian and Indonesian and Japanese nationalism, and Korean indeed, are some of the others that clearly can be a real challenge for China. But Vietnam's interesting because, as I recount in the book, I put a question once to a Vietnamese diplomat. Actually, it wasn't my question, it was a colleague's question. The question was put to him, look, if Vietnam gets into trouble with China in the South China Sea, i.e. if the shooting starts, because of course they do have direct territorial disputes, who's going to come to Vietnam's aid? Who really will come to your aid? Can you really count on the Americans or whoever else it might be? And this very senior diplomat, Vietnamese diplomat, I think looked he didn't skip a beat. He just looked very coolly back at his interlocutors and just said, the Vietnamese people. And I'm sure he was speaking from experience, because in a sense, as you say, if Vietnam has humbled America in living memory, and of course France before that, and if much of that was through really, I think, the power of Vietnamese nationalism and the solidarity and resilience of its people, then China is going to be actually careful. I think that we've got to remember that China has fought Vietnam before in 1979. It was actually a stalemate and a grand folly by the Chinese. The Vietnamese, I think, don't forget this kind of thing. And I think in a sense, they're very pragmatic now in engaging with America, Australia and others. But they're looking to their own defences, buying submarines from the Russians and so forth. So I think Vietnam is a partner worth cultivating, although of course for a country like Australia, we've got to bear in mind that we really can't exaggerate the congruence of political values with Vietnam, which is also a communist one-party state, but very important. On the other question about institutions, the Asia-Pacific versus the Indo-Pacific, at one level this gets a little bit esoteric because it's all about acronyms and meetings of diplomats and so on, but it obviously has a serious intent, because over time, if groups of nations collectively form in their own minds a sense of region, and look at Europe, look at the European Union, for example, it can have very tangible, real effects. And if that's not happening in the Indo-Pacific, then is it just really, a flight of my imagination? Well, the reality is a little bit different, because in fact, a lot of the so-called Asia-Pacific institutions, and APEC is one, because of course it's called Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and it doesn't include India, and it does include China. APEC's actually a very weak institution. As Gareth Evans used to call it, it was 4 adjectives in search of a noun. And in fact, APEC has increasingly, I think, been eclipsed by another institution over the last 15 years, which is called the East Asia Summit. But what's fascinating about the East Asia Summit, which is now really the crowning regional institution, and along with the East Asia Summit, there are several others, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus, and so forth. It's actually an Indo-Pacific institution already. So one of the developments my book recounts is that in the 1990s, as our leaders, our diplomats were trying to build this sense of regional community, we thought we were building it around East Asia and the Asia Pacific, but once we drew up the membership lists, it became the Indo-Pacific. And a key point was in 2005, when Australia, and I remember this as an intelligence analyst following it very closely, when Australia was trying to join this new East Asia Summit, and China worked very actively to try to exclude Australia and India and New Zealand from the East Asia Summit. Our friends in Southeast Asia and Japan worked very hard to get us through the door. And so the creation of the East Asia Summit in 2005 was actually a turning point towards the Indo-Pacific. Now, it doesn't mean that these institutions are finished, because there isn't great depth. You know, there aren't formal secretariats or large bodies of treaties or so on underlying them, but it's a beginning. However, I think that the real diplomacy of the Indo-Pacific is going to work simultaneously at 3 levels. There will be the big bilateral relationships, there will be these multilateral forums like the East Asia Summit, but it's going to be the minilaterals, as I said, the small, capable, self-selecting groups that are going to make all the difference. And I think that's where Australia can play an outsized role.
Our next 2 questions, a number of attendees have asked about the Belton Road in the context of the Victorian government. We've certainly seen the United States make a few comments. We've seen the Australian government potentially being dragged into that, whether that's through ultimately on an individual basis with FIRB or whatever. But certainly, you know, that is an issue of some controversy at the moment. So if you could comment on that. But the other one is that do you consider it likely that we will see a hot conflict take place in the Indo-Pacific in the coming years? And you and I had a bit of a talk about this this afternoon. In 1965, of course, in Indonesia, with the 30 September movement, what started as a reaction to a communist activity ended up being an anti-Chinese pogrom. Now, the Chinese are now, you know, they've come out of the century of humiliation. Is it likely, much like the Americans would do, that you think that perhaps you may see a Chinese intervention if something like that ever happened again in its area of influence to Chinese people?
Yeah. Look, short answer to the second question is yes, and we'll come back to that. And again, I say, watch Wolf Warrior 2. But on the Belt and Road, look, the, you know, starting point, the region needs investment. And when I say the region, I don't just mean Victoria, I mean the Indo-Pacific. All of these countries need investment, they need infrastructure, and they need it on terms of good governance, environmental sustainability, and so forth. And a lot of the BRI activities that China undertakes don't fit those criteria. But we need the investment in infrastructure. It's going to happen in the region, regardless of whether countries sign essentially blank check agreements with the Chinese government called Belton Road Memoranda of Understanding. And unfortunately, that seems to be what the Victorian government has done. 7 years ago, when Xi Jinping essentially dreamed up the BRI, the Belton Road, it was called One Belt, One Road back then, because of course, like all roads leading to Rome, all roads in the Belton Road lead back to China, lead back to Beijing. But when he came up with the Belton Road initiative, and once his bureaucrats realised he was serious, about it, there began an intense campaign of propaganda, an intense campaign of persuading the region, persuading developing countries in particular, but also developed countries, that what they really needed was not only Chinese investment and infrastructure, but Chinese investment and infrastructure essentially on political terms that suited the interests of the Communist Party. In other words, every time a foreign government is given a draft agreement by Chinese diplomats, very much worded in Beijing, worded in language that will essentially praise the ideology of the Chinese system, because that's basically what these agreements do. Every time those governments then sign those agreements without negotiating them first, and New Zealand did this even before Victoria, and a bunch of countries in Eastern Europe and Africa and elsewhere have done the same, it actually undermines the position for all of the other countries. It weakens the position for, let's say, the Solomon Islands or Papua New Guinea or Vanuatu, or any country that needs investment and infrastructure, but actually would like it to be delivered in terms that are based on good governance, labour rights, environmental sustainability, so many of the values you would want if someone was building a highway in your neighbourhood. Unfortunately, the Victorian government let down its regional neighbours by simply signing the document that it was given, a document that is entirely uncritical about the kinds of developments that might follow. And also, problematically, the Victorian government did so, it appears to be against the advice of the Commonwealth government on what is essentially a foreign policy issue, which under the Constitution is the Commonwealth's business. So we've got a problem. I think I'd like to see Canberra and Melbourne find ways of, moderating this and winding back. I don't think Pompeo's intervention was helpful. In fact, I think it was really unhelpful, because it was ill-informed, and he seemed to connect the Victorian Belton Road MOU with issues about telecommunications and 5G, which are quite separate, and where Australia is already extremely robust. And of course, you then get some whataboutism whenever people, like me, criticise Chinese economic coercion. You'll hear criticism of America as well. So that was a pity. The US Embassy has very wisely intervened now to backtrack from Pompeo's statement, and that is as it should be. Finally, on your really, I think, provocative question about hot conflicts, I think it is a fair question to ask. And in the final chapter of the book, I look at plausible futures, including the many situations that could lead to a hot conflict in the Indo-Pacific. I do think that the trend lines are bad. The trend lines are towards the Chinese government, the party, raising expectations in the Chinese people that whenever Chinese nationals get in trouble anywhere in the world, no matter why, the People's Liberation Army will be there to help them. Now, of course, that is a pretty extreme fantasy in many circumstances. But a little bit like the Rambo movies in America in the 1980s, I do think there's a psychological effect of this kind of culture that raises the expectation that the PLA, because let's face it, China is spending vast amounts of money on the PLA, and this has been widely advertised to the Chinese people, expectations that the PLA can intervene and will intervene. Of course, the reality is that China is actually quite risk averse. I think one of the points I would say in China's favour over the past few decades is that, it makes a lot of noise, but in fact, when it comes to the crunch, it's very risk averse when it comes to conflict. The last time the PLA fired shots in anger was against a bunch of hapless Vietnamese Marines stranded on a reef in 1988. And there's footage of that you can find online if you really want to see something very unpleasant, but also against Chinese nationals, students and young people in the centre of Beijing. The PLA is powerful, has enormous budget growth and so forth, but it is untested in combat. And so the first time, and it will happen, the first time that the Chinese leadership makes a decision to send the PLA to intervene, whether it's for a stabilisation mission or an anti-terrorist mission somewhere overseas, the dice will be rolled and a big gamble will have been taken. And we just don't know which way that will go. It could be very bad for regional order or for the legitimacy of the party. And I would put the small island states in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, as well as a number of countries in Africa, as being the most likely places where eventually this could happen.
Now, that just about takes us to the end of the evening. What a great evening, but I'll just...
Not a cheery ending for you there, Paul. Sorry about that.
Well, I'll shoot you with one other question to you that perhaps you could give us in 2 bullet points or very quickly. What is Australia's gravest misstep regarding the Indo-Pacific region in recent times? And on the other side of the coin, what is its best initiative in terms of the Indo-Pacific region in recent times?
Okay, they're great questions. And, you know, although I'm generally pretty sympathetic to our policymakers, I don't mind mentioning missteps. Well, it depends how far back you want to take recent times. But I would say that, look, on the positives first, the whole, I guess, diplomatic entrepreneurialism that Australia has shown with this idea, the fact that, you know, our foreign policy and defence policy white papers have really led the regional diplomatic push towards this Indo-Pacific redefinition. You know, Australia's done a lot of creative work behind the scenes to engage with countries like India, Indonesia, Japan, building a lot of these minilaterals, rebuilding the Quad. You know, Australia has been a lot more creative than I think it's given credit for. So I would wrap all of that up, if you like, almost as the Indo-Pacific strategy in the making. We're not there yet, because strategy involves you know, ways, ends and means. It involves much greater mobilisation of resources than we've probably achieved yet. But I think Australia is on the right path there. What have been the missteps? I think there have been times when Australian governments have been very inconsistent and have, I guess, taken positions and then stepped back. I mean, the withdrawal from the Quad in 2007 was an example of that. The unfortunate way in which the submarine deal with Japan played out several years ago was another, where I think Japan's expectations were raised, but Australia in the end, for I'm sure technical reasons, chose a different submarine design. I think that made things a little bit awkward with a really important relationship. And I think there have been times when Australia's been inconsistent. So we talked a lot about a rules-based order in the region, but then until not so many years ago, we were not exactly adhering to a rules-based order in aspects of our relationship with East Timor and the Timor Gap. So I would say there have been such moments, but I think overwhelmingly Australia is on now, I think, a sensible path in its regional diplomacy. I don't envy our policymakers engaging with China. They come in for a lot of criticism from both sides. But I think the way forward is going to be really standing Australia's ground in Australia's interest and being patient, because, you know, again, I have a lot of sympathy for those who will have difficulty from the economic leverage that China is bringing to bear against Australia. But if you take a time frame of years rather than a political cycle of weeks, months and so forth, I think that Australia will prove to be resilient and will in fact be a more effective partner for China in the region afterwards.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation tonight. Great questions, really entertaining. Can I again recommend to people that Rory's book is a very, very good read indeed. I would strongly recommend it. It's $32.99 if you want it in the flesh, if you're old-fashioned like me, or $15 if you want it electronically. But there's the link you can see on the screen there, Black Ink Books, if you're interested in it. So again, thank you, Rory, for being the guest of the AIIA Queensland branch. You can have a look at our website for our upcoming webinars, and of course, in this current environment, our our other branches of the AIIA in other states and territories and nationally have got some really interesting stuff on as well, including a really good webinar tomorrow night, if I recall correctly, from the ACT. So thanks again very much, Rory, and thank you everybody for attending.